Welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. And this week's show is all about the website Atlas of Family Names in Ireland, and it's the UCC website. It's got a wonderful whole resource on the Atlas of Family Names in Ireland, and that was compiled by William J. Smith, who was part of the faculty in geography in UCC for many years and is absolutely an expert on the Old Scottish, New English Scottish names, Petty survey and all the project source that would have come about here. So I'm going to treat the resource in detail for family history research and put a blog together on it because it's so useful. The opening of this website is the introduction. And then you have Mapping Ancestral Territories, the rationale behind Family Names in Ireland project. So this was done quite a long time ago, but they did use ready-made and innovative GIS platform, which involved the digital mapping and data displays. So it's very robust. It has actually stood the test of time. It's allowed for the selection and digital mapping of over 250 family names at both the baronial scale for 1659 and the very intimate civil parish scale from Griffith's valuation, c. 1850. Now, both these scales and terms require explanation. Baronies in Ireland were created a lot in certain counties in the 16th century. So that brings you back to quite a good account. And the 17th century 1659 maps are now available through the TCD website. So a lot of these sources that he's talking about are really complemented at this time. In sum, the work represents, quote, the mapping of 10% of the family names of Ireland for two time periods specified. So that's for the 17th century, based on the baronial structure, and Griffith's valuation, which was based on the civil parish, and that was the state parish at the time, prior to Ireland gaining independence and becoming the Irish Free State, as you would see on census and so on. A major focus of the phase of the project was to seek an understanding of the transformations in names and their distribution between the mid-17th century and mid-19th century. And this is something that I'm very heavily engaged with as a researcher and also as part of the Genealogy Radio Show. The sample of surnames involved a number of considerations for this project, and it was done in 1890. Matheson, who became the General Registrar, and we've done a show on Matheson, identified the most 100 numerous surnames in Ireland using data from his Registrar's General files. All of these first 100 surnames have been mapped for 1850 and, if applicable, for 1659. A key consideration was to identify and interpret family names analysis in originating regions in geographical expansion of the number of key immigrant groups who have settled in Ireland. So clearly the most dominant and widespread of the surnames related to the Gaelic era, and the sample of surnames mapped reflect this situation. The critical concern was the use of this was to identify the localities where the Scandinavian, Irish, the Anglo-Norman, the New English and the Scots settled. This is of huge interest because when you go through the sources, you will see that suddenly the Scots were in Mayo in the 16th century. So obviously they didn't all return home, and it leaves their surnames as well and where they have an example. For example, the surname Cotter, Scandinavian Irish, Fitzgerald, Butler, Walsh, Old English, and Bell and Campbell, New English Scots, are illustrated in parts of this. The Documents of Ireland phase allowed for the origins and expansion of first and second names in Ireland. This is really, really important. There were graduate work done on the Annals of Ulster and the Annals of Inishfallen, and the transformation of Irish society, just as what happens now, where the influence of first names gives a crucial and innovative naming pattern. And that was done from 800 to 1200 AD, so I'd love it if that was followed on with a lot more research, even if they are all called Donnock and Morrock and Brian and so on. It is very important to see the names as they come about. The outcome of the Documents of Ireland was the mapping of all family names in the 1659, and so it really, really helps. Wolf's pioneering study, Irish Names and Surnames, 1906, and this is available on the Ask About Ireland website free of charge, was most helpful publication of MacLysot's Irish Families and the Surnames of Ireland. Very little sustained research has been carried out on the origins, meaning and geographical expression of Irish family names. So it is really important that we start to get back to grips with how important this is in Irish cultural studies. The people involved in this were Keith Sidwell, Margaret Lantry, Kenneth Nichols, Millie Glennon, David Joyce, Almer Barry, Joanne McCarthy. They're all Niall Buttimer, Kenneth Nichols, Jim McLaughlin, and the National University of Ireland, Maureen Nihonica for her scholarship too, and Vera Ryan. So there was a lot went on here in the 90s on this. And it opens with mapping ancestral connections or territories. So very, very nice indeed. The counties were characterised not only complicated by geological and settlement histories, but also by highly uneven, layered and contested symbolic landscapes. Place names, first names, surnames constitute a very distinctive and integral component of the country's symbolic universe. Beautifully written, and the delight of the geographer, such with names, given their embedded local qualities, were amenable to detailed mapping. With the internet now, what we're able to do as well in relation to this and how we can source place names is incredibly important. I know places I could not find 20 years ago are freely available through the wonderful databases of townlands.ie, where I can just literally go through a list online and go, that's the name of it in English, that's the name of it in Irish, what do I have here in front of me? Oh, that's the closest when I know the particular territory, and so on. For example, in many cases, people do this in America. They actually put the townland or the parish on the headstone. They're very proud of being from a certain location in a county. So that spelling may get corrupted on the headstone. So you're looking for RD in Limerick, but it's actually Ardagh, the parish of Ardagh. That happens. We know it's not the townland of Ardo. We know because we can't find the evidence for that surname in that particular townland. But we can find it in the parish that's 20 miles away. So these are really, really important clues of how you look and what you'll be looking for here. So these names provide important clues to the questions of colonisation, conflict, conquest, accommodation and assimilation. The atlas was focused on the first and second names in the last 1,000 years. The analysis of place names is another day's work, but it would be beautiful to see an atlas of Irish place names. I know there have been studies done and that they are very good, but if they could link all the parts together, it would be absolutely fantastic. So part 1 looks at the origins and consequences of the battles and the patterns for first name. Part 2 explores the geographical transformations in second names. Part 3 addresses the issues of attrition, mediation, hybridity by exploring the changing geography and the O-Mac forms amongst Irish surnames. The 17th century sources mainly written, especially that of the 1659, is a crucial vantage point with which to view and chart and ebb and flow the naming patterns as key signifiers of change, conquest, adaptation, transformation and revival. Unravelling the territorial domains is only part of the story, but what a wonderful story it is. So the listing of the surnames allows the researchers to identify and map the distribution of the Anglo-Norman settlers who were known as the Old English by the mid-17th century. So the surnames included here are Barry, Brannock, Brown, Burke, Butler, Croke, Fitzgerald, Fitzmaurice, Fitzsimons, Nagle, Power, Redmond, Roach, Russell, Tyrrell. And they're included in the mapping of this. So they do a distribution of the Gaelic and old surnames and so on. And it's an absolutely terrific map. I will be actually just taking the maps, blowing them up and putting them into the blog so that you can see them in their wonderfulness, because they really are great. The strength of the Gaelic tradition near Cork City will see that what's going on with the crossover in the 13th century. The inland Gaelic worlds of Laois Offaly and its borderlands are also made clear, as is the weak Norman surname imprint in the wetter lands of North Connacht, north to West Leinster and all of Ulster, exclusive of East Down and Antrim, Eastern Cork, so on. So you really get a level of how things are happening with assimilation between the two traditions and the confirming the great regions of the Irishry as they were known as the Middle Ages. Other questions asked of the 1659 census and data sources are ask about the assimilation, because this is what happens. People assimilate. There's a crossover between surnames and so on. In this wonderful piece, there's an accessible county hearth records that's County Tipperary by Lafan. So that's absolutely wonderful. That's available. Sometimes you're going to get the availability of these hearth records, and you do get them in Northern Ireland and so on. They're very, very useful. So when you have a thing happening over time, you do get the sources suddenly starting to tell you what's happening with the surnames. So he looks at the first naming patterns among the descendants of the Old Irish, amongst the Ryans, Mahers, O'Kennedys and O'Dwyers, and they're all of Gaelic stock, and how they mix and how they marry, and that can be really useful. So the patterns of Gaelic Christian names amongst Gaelic families is mapped as well, and that's absolutely terrific, and that's done in Tipperary, so you can see just how wonderfully mapped that is. The 1659 does not provide the same richness of data on Christian first names, but it's detailed in listing the first and second names of the highest poll tax payers, the titulados, the gentry, the professionals, the merchants, and it's highly instructive. So that's a clue in itself. When you see then the first and surname of the titulado, you know what's going on here. We get to see the richness of what's happening. So the retention of ancient first names or medieval Gaelic names, when I click on that map, well then I get a clue as to what's going on. And funny enough, when I look at Thomond, I'm getting a loose adherence to the distribution of European style first names amongst the Old Irish gentry. So that's actually telling us European style. So very good here, because it is showing a high listing. No data available for Galway or Mayo on that, but these maps can be interpreted and debated and so on. So very useful. The regional and diverse Irish cultural expression is wonderful in how, for example, fewer than 20% of the women's first names belong in County Tipperary in 1660 to the older Gaelic naming tradition. So there's a lot going on there. A lot of it, though, too, will be data. And that's not to argue what happens with religion. The universal saints' names had not penetrated into Irish life before 1169. The Christian names Michael and Paul began to arrive after 1020, while Edmund, John, Margaret, Maria, Nicholas began to make appearances before 1120, but the full introduction of continental saints' names awaited the coming of the Anglo-Norman knights and their religious orders. That is something that's news to me and absolutely a wonderful source. To explore the word in greater depth, the use of Irish language sources is essential. O'Corran and Maguire have written that the early Irish had an extraordinary variety of personal names. As many as 12,000 such names are documented in early Irish sources, which fell out of fashion at a very early stage. Over the period 770 to 1120, the Annals of Ulster record the use of 1,000 individuals, admittedly aristocratic first names, but very, very significant. It's a record, and it's going back that far, and it's prior to surnames, because we seem to think of surnames all the time, but we forget that they didn't always exist, and so on. So a wonderful account of that. Again, you have Connor as a first name, which is very, very interesting indeed in the 1659 census. And considering that in Thomond it was nearly the name of all the O'Briens, it doesn't have that much of it's not the highest usage in the 17th century. So again, this is of huge interest, and even how things are becoming anglicised and what's happening and so on. So wonderful accounts of that. Part 2, we have Wolf's Sláinte Gael Gal, Irish names and surnames, and that links to 11,500 Irish surnames and their English language forms. This list reflects the Americanization as well as the Anglicization of Irish forms, and takes into account the renderings of 3,700 surnames documented by Wolf in their original Irish language versions. So a very, very useful, even if it's 1906, published version and so on. These are, we have the distribution of the settler names in Ulster in the mid-17th century. So we have a wonderful map on that. And that again is so worth looking at, where you can start seeing what's going on. By the 16th century, Gaelic and Gaelicised Ireland was an expansive, confident world, and both the Irish language and Irish surname forms predominant in such regions. English speech and English name forms were concentrated in the Pale and Dublin and a few other key port cities and regional pockets elsewhere. But by the early 18th century, in contrast, the English language and British culture was in favour of anglicised surname forms. The Tudor, Cromwellian, Williamite conquests began the beginning of linguistic conquest and chronicled with geographical precision. Between the 1530s and the 1660s is a number of documents written in English. These begin with defiance of Henry VIII and Elizabeth, which provide in extraordinary detail the name forms of many of the Irish population in the 16th century, and this became stronger with the 1641 depositions and the Hearth money records, and culminates in key sources, the 1659 census. So these are all wonderful mapping tools for the principal Irish surnames, where the third of the family names in 69s were rooted in a single barony and not prevalent elsewhere in Ireland. This is really important because it's showing a tying to place that you're going to get with what's happening here in relation to the dislocation of lands and so on. And it's something that can prove people were there once. They may not have been allowed to stay there, but this is where they were, and this is where the actual clan name originated from. And this is the way to prove it. This is the way to go back with it. It's also the way to be able to look at it, the introduction and names and so on. So it's a wonderful way of doing that. So the core names, part 3, the 1659 list of principals, surnames. We get the medieval attrition of the O and the Mach in family surnames by the mid-17th century, and we get the rejuvenation of it in the 20th and the 21st century. And that's little compared to who brought it back and who did not. We can identify 4 cultural regions and how the O and the Mach surnames are being used there and what's culturally happening. And that's really, really something that requires a lot of detail and so on. So this is a terrific source. The bibliography and the notes and the referencing alone is worth cutting and pasting, and I will be doing that because I think it's of huge importance. It then goes on to how the digital maps were created, the articles on that, and the names, the full index to the principles of Irish surnames. And I will definitely be putting it together in a blog and so on, because it is just absolutely so useful and really deserves highlighting and making sure that people understand that it's there. The appendices here, the names that carry through the 5 periods, all that, everything So a terrific job. So that's all for today. We looked at the Atlas of Irish Surnames, and just as you have the Atlas of the Irish Famine and the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, I'd love it if they did the Atlas of the Irish Surnames. And it would be just fabulous. So I'm hoping that that will happen. That's all for today. I have a listing of all the shows right up to Series 8, and I will be starting again with 3 new students in January, the co-op office in the University of Limerick, so we'll be on many projects again for the next 6 months. They're of a huge help to me, and we'll make sure that everything is updated and so on. So that's all for today. And thank you for listening. Please do contact me at irishroots@clansandsurnames.com if you have any further queries, and I'd be delighted to address them.